Okay, so here's part two. What we're going to do here is do a little more work in applying the principles of just war theory to terrorism and to modern warfare to see if we can start articulating what it is that makes terrorism distinctively wrong, if anything, and how we might also use those same tools to analyze the waging of modern war. The question is whether terrorism can be condemned using just war theory. In other words, does terrorism clearly fail the test of ethical forms of combat if we analyze it using just war theory? So I have this picture here of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. This was a terror attack in the United States in the 1990s. And the reason I'm choosing to show this image is just to remind people that when we're talking about terrorism, we're not necessarily talking about terrorism that comes from the Middle East and that's motivated by Muslim religious principles. The bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was done by two white Americans who were anti-government. And that's the reason why they targeted this federal building in Oklahoma City. They drove a truck full of explosives up to the front of the building and caused mass destruction, as you can see here. So what is it about that act or other acts of terror that is wrong, and can we use just war theory to figure that out? Well, there's a link, according to Michael Walzer, between terror and war. He says these are not two distinct things, but things that we can actually see are tied together. And he says that terror really began to grow out of World War II and out of the tactics of guerrilla warfare that came after that. So we've already talked about carpet bombing. Carpet bombing is the practice of indiscriminately dropping bombs over a city without even trying to distinguish between military and non-military targets. We already also talked about nuclear bombs. So these are two things that were developed and used during World War II. And then in the Vietnam War, that was when we had the start of what's called guerrilla warfare tactics. So in that war, that was the first time the United States military really encountered this style of fighting in which you had enemy soldiers who, in this context, were using the Vietnamese jungle as camouflage. They were using surprise tactics, sneak tactics. They would often do things that were unexpected. They often fought out of uniform or would use civilians to help them achieve their goals. So in this context, it became very, very difficult to use the principles of just warfare during the fighting of that war. The U.S. military was often criticized, and there have been a few scandals, including several massacres in Vietnam, that have been the result of the U.S. military is trying to kind of figure out how to fight this type of war. So the guerrilla warfare, this non-traditional warfare, in which it's not two armies clearly facing each other on a field of battle where they're in uniform and you can tell who's who, is one of the things that, according to Walzer, introduced modern terrorism. Because like with these other two topics, it becomes these other two acts of carpet bombing and nuclear bombs, Vietnam War guerrilla war tactics, it was another element where it became very, very difficult to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. So one of the first things that Walzer wants us to know is that acts of terror could actually meet the criteria for just war theory. Now, Walzer is not for terrorism. He's just trying to point out that just war theory probably isn't going to be sufficient to condemn these acts. So first, if we look at them using the terms of discrimination, he says that terrorists can and do discriminate between desired and undesired targets. Now, that's different than discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. So usually terrorists are not targeting military personnel, and we already saw that. But they do have an idea of who is deserving of being attacked and who is not. We're not going to agree with those ideas probably as outside observers, but from the terrorist's own mindset, they do discriminate between desired and undesired targets. And he gives us some examples of this in these three scenarios from the past that we might categorize as terrorism. First was the assassination attempt of the Grand Duke Sergei. In that case, the assassin didn't put the bomb that was supposed to kill the Grand Duke in the car where he was riding because there were other people in there that he didn't consider legitimate targets. Secondly, the IRA bombing, that was the example with the person with the timed bomb on his bicycle who went to the wrong place. He bombed the wrong place, and he was condemned by the other members of the Irish Republican Army, which is pretty commonly viewed as a terrorist organization because he did not target the right people. He killed what they considered innocent people. And then finally, the Cairo assassination of the British official. This is the distinction between who is another example of the terrorists themselves distinguishing between who and who is not a legitimate target. So according to Walzer, this is just to illustrate the point that if you were to ask people engaging in these types of acts, they too have an idea of who is and is not a legitimate target. Now again, that doesn't mean, Walzer is not saying that therefore terrorism is good or okay. He's just saying that this by itself isn't going to be enough to allow us to condemn terrorism. He also says, and MacPherson, the second author, will also make this point, that there are many similarities between terror and modern warfare. Just like with modern warfare, we could evaluate the justness of the cause of terrorism. In other words, the cause of the terrorist might be just or unjust. Until we find out what that cause is, we don't know, right? So this is something that we could evaluate. And it may possibly be that we would sympathize with the cause even if we don't like the methods. They both involve the death of non-combatants, and it is sometimes intentional in both terrorism and war. And they both incite fear among civilians. So this is a direct goal of terrorism sometimes, is to create fear among civilians. It is also sometimes a goal of modern warfare. So one psychological tactic is to create fear among the civilians in a nation in order to get them to pressure their government to end the war, to stop the war, maybe even surrender. And then oftentimes there's a question of last resort. So in the first lecture, we talked about, in terms of use ad bellum, things to think about before going to war, that waging war should always be a last resort, that you should try things like negotiation first. And most of us want to say that terrorists clearly are not trying other methods. They're going straight to violence as their last resort. There's been a lot of question about that regarding the U.S. military as well, in the current engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, whether we really needed to engage in warfare or whether there may have been other less violent options to engage in first. So it's at least questionable whether there's a last resort in both cases, not just with terrorism. So for MacPherson, this is going to lead him to question whether we can defend modern warfare while at the same time condemning terrorism as clearly unethical. He says there are lots and lots of similarities, as we've seen, between terror and war, including these things that we've already mentioned. And he says there's really no difference between practices of war and terror. So if we're going to accept his idea here, if we're going to go along with him that there are really no differences, we have a choice now. We have to either seriously reform the way we conduct ourselves in war, or accept that terror may be legitimately useful in some instances. So this is a pretty difficult decision to make. Most people don't want to drastically reconsider how we conduct war because oftentimes the U.S. military considers itself very good at what it does. And so reforming that, not using certain tactics or certain weapons at our disposal, might be seen as creating a weakness. We certainly also don't want to accept the use of terror in some instances, though. So if it is in fact true that modern warfare and terrorism are not uniquely different from each other, there's not a major distinction to be made between one and the other, and the same things that are wrong with terrorism are often also wrong with modern warfare, we probably need to think about whether modern warfare has gone down an unethical path from which we need to rescue it, or whether we might be compelled to allow for terrorism in some instances if we're going to allow modern warfare to be waged using these questionable means that don't meet the criteria of just war theory.